Haunted Castle is a 1987-1988-ish arcade game that is perhaps best known for two things: being the first arcade entry in the soon-to-be long-running Castlevania series, and for being cheap and difficult, but mostly cheap. Cut to 2024 and the surprise drop of the Castlevania Dominus Collection, which collects the three DS Igavanias, Dawn of Sorrow, Portrait of Ruin, and Order of Ecclesia, and doing a hell of a job with them too, finding a nice way to work around stylus gimmickry by turning your right stick into a stylus-like thing and implementing traditional button inputs for other stylus gimmick things. But then comes the curious addition of Haunted Castle. Not only the Japanese version, generally the easier, more balanced version of Haunted Castle over the overly cheap American version, which is not included in this set, but in a bit of a surprise, a brand new remake in the form of Haunted Castle Revisited, which takes the old Haunted Castle game and turns it into a proper Classicvania style game as opposed to whatever it was originally. Much like the original game this is based upon, Haunted Castle Revisited tells an epic tale of a young happy couple having gotten married, only for the Count to swoop in and nab the bride. Now the vampire hunter, who may or may not be named Simon, so let's just call him Simon because fuck it, we're remaking Castlevania 1 again basically, must venture through 6 perilous levels to rescue the bride and down the Count. A feat that is easier said than done, as you'll have to contend with endless armies of the dead, fantastically aggressive bosses, tight time limits, and the occasional bit of cheapness. After all, it wouldn't be Haunted Castle without that bit of cheapness. To anyone who has played an old school Castlevania game, this should be old hat. You start the game with a leather whip as your starting weapon, and striking candles will drop items such as whip upgrades, sub-weapons, hearts to power said sub-weapons, money items for points, and the occasional pot roast, which is also hidden in some bits of scenery. And this is indeed traditional Classicvania fare. No more picking up swords or axes for main weapons, you get a morning start for an upgrade, and also a temporary upgrade that turns your flail into a sword whip looking thing that does slightly more damage. Sub-weapons may also look a bit different but are also fairly traditional. Aside from the usual dagger and throwing axe, you also have the boomerang, which is self-explanatory, the torch, which is your firebomb / holy water stand-in, and a cross that acts as a screen-clearing nuke of sorts, but is rather worthless against bosses. You have a number of lives, you have the options for continues, and stage select restart at later stages once you've cleared them. Oh, and falling into pits won't automatically kill you, they'll just respawn back to a point while taking a bit of damage, which is a mechanic from the arcade game that made sense because it only had one life in that game, but here, I don't know, it makes some people happy at least. I'm just glad to have lives and stages broken up into segments that act as checkpoints to restart in should I need them. Haunted Castle Revisited is down to basics Classicvania. You can only whip left or right, you can't jump on or off stairs, there are no item crashes unless you want to count the cross as an item crash of sorts, and there's nothing in the way of multiple paths or alternate characters. Just about the only update to the gameplay is a controllable jump, which I do appreciate, and when you think about it, it makes sense. It's remaking an old arcade game and you want to try and keep it as classic as possible. And Haunted Castle is considered by some to be a remake of the original 8-bit Castlevania anyway, so this would technically be the umpteenth remake of that title. But then again, so was Super Castlevania 4, so was Castlevania Chronicles. I'm just saying it's okay to do a little more than just the bare minimum, which a lot of these people seem to be happy with doing or playing these days. I don't know, just a thought. In any event, all that said, Haunted Castle Revisited is a perfectly fine game. It takes an old, crusty, virtually unplayable arcade game and turns it into something more palatable. And for what it does and for what it is, essentially a bonus game of sorts in a compilation of 3 larger games, it gets the job done in a manner similar to the old Castlevania The Adventure Rebirth that came out on Wii ages ago, and it just hurts saying that actually. Look, control is pretty spot on and buttons can be remapped if desired. The gameplay is fairly tight and solid. The levels are familiar fare to anyone who has touched the arcade original, but with enough tweaks and new elements added in that it doesn't feel like a complete rehash. The boss battles here are just great, including the final battle, which is a big step above the original versions by a wide margin. Despite my usual misgivings for these things, Revisited does more than one would expect out of what is essentially a throwaway bonus on a collection of games with 3 big draws featured, and that deserves some kind of commendation. That said, there are some quibbles, of course. I don't like how some projectiles can't be destroyed with your weapons, often something that could be done in most Castlevania games. Some enemy placement still feels a bit cheap. particularly the fourth stage where you're making it descent down several levels, and the floor right beneath you has a skeleton pelting you with bones, so yeah, that's a bit annoying. The game is also a bit on the short side, which is to be expected since this is a remake of an old arcade game and perhaps sticks too close to the source material maybe. And with a more balanced difficulty and gameplay, a seasoned player of the series should be able to conquer this one on the normal difficulty within an hour's time, possibly less than that, being generous. You could toggle the difficulty to be easier or harder, which I believe alters the enemy placement somewhat, but even then, Haunted Castle Revisited is never going to match up to the frustration level produced by the arcade original's jank, cheap design. And that is a good thing, by the way. Haunted Castle Revisited does sport some pretty sweet visuals. It uses enough of the Haunted Castle graphical assets as a base and enhances them in a way that makes them look just a bit nicer in terms of animation and appearance. The game plays out in widescreen, which gives you more visibility, but does make everything appear slightly smaller compared to the arcade original. Not that it really matters because the game does good with what they were working with. It's not a total win, however. Some of the stage backdrops do look a bit on the cheap, low-res JPEG side of things. Some of the mountain scenery, for example, in the last stage. And some of the enemy redesigns like the harpies are kinda meh, but an otherwise fine-looking game. This being a remake or a revisit or whatever, Haunted Castle redid the original tracks to something up to a more modern standard, and I guess you could say they're what the cool kids call bangers. Bloody Tears gets another wonderful take because that song is hard to mess up, unless it's on Game Boy. The basement track is tolerable now. The second stage tune is more haunting, and they added the usual player death fanfare whenever you die because it's not Classicvania without it or something. Sound effects are fine, they're crisp, they're smooth, and there's also the usual collection of grunts, growls, screams, and yelps of pain that are the pinnacle of vocal performances or something to that extent, I don't know. So to reiterate, this is a bonus thing on the Castlevania Dominus Collection, which is a solid collection that brings 3 classic Igavania games out of Nintendo DS purgatory and onto other platforms. And the games themselves are still pretty great. Well, 2 of them are still great, the other I can somewhat tolerate, but that's another story for another year. Either way, that's enough of a reason to get this collection if you've enjoyed these games in the past or never got a chance to try these in the first place, which you should if you're into the whole genre of things. But don't discount this Haunted Castle remake either, because even though this is just an extra of sorts, it's still a damn fine game and a more than satisfying salvage operation of what was once a relatively obscure and quite frankly not very good arcade game. Would have been nice if this were available as a solo thing instead of a bonus game because I feel it's strong enough to stand on its own, but whatever the case, Haunted Castle Revisited is superb and well worth checking out. Hey, wait a minute, where are the end credits crediting the original makers of the arcade game? Simple text blurb isn't gonna cut it. Put it end credits or there'll be an outrage. Actually, I really don't care. Those folks are probably in witness protection or whatever the Japanese equivalent is anyway after making said game, so probably for the best. I'm going to bed. Good night.